Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to all of you to the Youth Workshop on Sustainable Lifestyles, Knowing the Unknown, organized by EU Switch Asia Regional Policy Advocacy Component in association with UNEP and the Terry School of Advanced Studies. By 2030, the global middle class is expected to reach 5.3 billion people, implying an addition of 2 billion people with increased purchasing power than today. Most of this growth is expected in Asia. China and India should together represent 66% of the global middle class population and 59% of middle class consumption. While this may be construed as the driver for economic development, changes in consumer behavior and consumer patterns are expected to increase demand for food, water, and energy by approximately 35%, 40%, and 50% respectively by 2030. Making commitments at COP26, which I'm sure all of you must have seen, that we have said that we would be generating about 500 gigawatts by 2030, and we are planning to go net zero by 2070. So all these things sound very encouraging, but it's definitely an arduous task because every habit, that we probably have, or every behavior that we have contributes towards what we call the emissions, or for that matter, the greenhouse gases. And it's very important to understand that how our consumption pattern, the supply chain or the value chain that is associated with the products that we consume actually contribute to water security or impacts energy security. And India is actually blessed with the largest youth population. We actually make these tall claims about demographic dividend that is there. And this youth that we are talking about has a huge potential to actually make changes by taking up informed choices. They are also probably great influencers, both in their houses, in their societies, and of course in the educational institutes in which they study. So with that in mind, the whole concept of this youth workshop on sustainable lifestyles, knowing the unknown, was to enhance awareness and alteration of actions amongst the largest demography of India on sustainable consumption, focusing on travel, tourism, food, fashion, and clothing. So we have our guests for today. Shomi is there, Adarsha is there, and then we'll subsequently have more people joining, Manav and Krishna, and Charvi has already joined. So I would really like to thank all of them for taking out time and joining us today. And on behalf of everyone present here, I want to extend a very warm welcome to each of the speakers for this session. Thank you, participants. We had almost about 138 registrations today, and we do have a few people who have joined right now, but we are hoping that more would be joining during the course of 3 hours, and that's quite encouraging. At least that sort of, gives us hope that so many people are at least interested in a topic like this, or are actually looking forward to leading a sustainable behavior. I would like to show you a very small clipping at this point in time. And this is from the movie Minimalism, which I think is one of the movies of the many, many movies that are there, which would be my strong recommendation to everybody who has joined us today, that if you find time, the movie is there on Netflix. Please do take out time
to watch. We spend
so
much time on the hunt, but nothing ever quite does it for us. And we get so wrapped up in the hunt that it kind of makes us miserable.
Black Friday shopping mania is still playing out tonight at malls across America.
High hopes of saving some big bucks on those holiday gifts.
Filled to the brim.
In some cases, it did turn violent.
We've, as a culture, have lost our minds.
There's no question that what it means to have achieved the American dream has increased tremendously in material terms.
This is not something that just happened yesterday. This is something that has been sold to us over the past 100 years by those that want to make a whole lot of money.
Now that's what I call a good-looking car.
You have this thing that you were obsessed about, but then the new version comes out, and now you no longer care about the one you have. In fact, the one you have is a source of dissatisfaction.
People are beginning to recognize that they've maybe been tricked.
There is no out until you become aware. You're not going to get happier by consuming more.
Ready?
I was born ready.
There's nothing wrong with consumption. The problem is compulsory consumption. We're tired of it. We're tired of acquiring things because that's what we're supposed to do.
When I heard about minimalism, it wasn't about just getting rid of my stuff. It was about taking control of my life and stop being told what to do and actually deciding what I wanted to do.
When I first started reducing the number of things in my life, I found out that I had 51 things in the entire world.
We've probably sold or donated at least 90% of our stuff.
As I started to move that stuff out, I was able to finally realize what I had sacrificed.
I don't know what the most common 3 words are in American homes. I don't know if it's I love you or if it's I want that.
This same thing that's not making us happy is also causing the degradation of our habitat.
We're going to have to give up a lot. The secret is that a lot of that we're not actually going to miss.
What I found with minimalism is it's a way of saying, let's stop the madness.
When you recognize that this life is yours and that it is your one and only, and when that seeps directly in your bones and you recognize that this is it, everything changes.
So thank you everyone for watching that little link. But I think yes, something very, very important that is there. That so just stop. Maybe yeah. So it's not, the problem is not with consumption, but the problem is with compulsory consumption. And on that note, I will invite my colleague Divija, who is here and who would be moderating the session henceforth. Divija has been helping me out with this project, and thank you, Divija, and over to you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Good evening, everyone. My name is Divija. I'm a master's student at TerrySAS, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. So I'll quickly run you through the event structure for today. So we have 4 sessions with us today, and they'll be on sustainable mobility, responsible tourism, food choices and their impacts, and lastly, ethical fashion. The sessions will be of 30 minutes of speaking time and 10 minutes for Q&A. I encourage you all to please drop your questions in the chat box, and we'll get back to you on them. And apart from that, just keep the conversation going and hope you have a great time today. Now I'll move on to our 4th co-speakers for the day. Ms. Somi Chatterjee is the director at One Station Million Stories, founder trustee at Trust for Regeneration of Indian Settlements, and principal conservation architect at Creative Footprints. Mr. Adarsh Kapoor is an architect and urban designer with expertise in urban design, master planning, public space design, and architectural design. They are both part of the team at Creative Footprints, an organization that aims to create spaces while intermingling urban design and conservation. I'll hand it over to you now. Thank you.
Is the screen visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are audible.
You are, yes.
Okay. Hi, good evening. Adarsh, would you like to introduce the topic and then I can go on?
This one topic is an interesting topic which affects all of us. Mobility, movement, how we move around in the city, how we access the city is something that affects all of us. And most of the cases, we somehow stay disassociated with this reality. So today, what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand what is mobility, what is sustainable mobility, and how it affects our lifestyles and various other choices. I will let Shomi start with the presentation, and then I will get back to the presentation. In case Shomi is not able to continue because of internet connectivity issues, I will sit with Shomi.
Hi. So just to make the point about sustainable mobility and the options that open out, so I just stepped out of the office. I walked down to this very brilliant site. Well, I'm presenting this from Srinagar, and I'll just show you what not so sustainable mobility might just look like. Look at the bridge on the other side where everyone's scurrying, and I don't know if you can see the movement of cars, this barrage of cars. And look at this from the other side. That's your daily evening life, and this is what you can enjoy if you opt for sustainable mobility and you enjoy your city likewise. So our point of our presentation, we're going to talk about some work that has been done and how opinions have been changed so far as opting for sustainable mobility is concerned. So this first slide that we have on our page that you see is a starting point. Just 1 second. Dude, please don't speak. These are some of the hazards of outdoor presentations. So what we do have in this particular slide is an example of community coming together to participate and to choose the right options for making sure that the area is safe, the area is accessible to all, and they conducted their own audits. Adarsh, could you show us slides of the audits or some reports that were done? Yeah, so just to be able to use the space actively and to be able to own up and to be able to enforce the fact that spaces, urban spaces are shared spaces, that we should be able to move freely, that we should be able to recreate freely. And that happens to be the first step towards sustainable mobility. Because when we interact with the landscape, we interact not just with the footpath, or we are not just looking down, we are interacting with the active edges that boomerang, that kind of allow us to move towards our destination, feel safe, and then we start developing a sense of belonging. So some of the steps that were taken is, one is a safety and street audit. This is for CR Park. And when the street audit was conducted, a lot of stretches which were previously understood as very safe were noted as unsafe, and the reasons why people do not actually use it became a part of a motion to convince the MLA, and now work is going to start to allocate street light, to level footpaths, to make sure that parking is arranged, the greenery is arranged, and that the space is usable by people of all age group, which is somehow the first step towards sustaining sustainable mobility. So the first step that we learned, the most important lesson that we learned in this exercise of moving with CR Park Green Community, with support from TRIS and many others, individuals and groups who are residents of the community, is that start by demanding right. Demand right, then sort technical issues, go to the authority responsible for it, demand what you're paying taxes for, and then you will get streets and you will get safe passage in very healthy community areas. Can we go to the next one? So this is a picture that what you're seeing is a Jamia Masjid in Srinagar city. And all I want to tell you with these couple of pictures of the old city is that our cities were actually built for sustainable mobility. The reason why this image, or the next one, could you go to the next one, please? Now, what you do see is the moment we start with this parking and other forms of interference, encroachment on the street, we take away the opportunity of enjoying the landscape and being able to use the street for what it's built for. Next picture. So if you do notice very closely, none of these streets ever had a dead end. They always culminated at some kind of, with some active interfaces and some activity. So at every 100 meters or about 15 minutes of walking, you would find a break in pace, an obvious place where there would be light, there would be commune, there would be people to just about make you safe and go ahead with a different to your destination. So these were inbuilt properties. It's only in the last, I think, 2 years that we are hearing this new term called the 15 minutes neighborhood or 15-minute cities. And when I started pacing and walking, or rather another term called shaded streets, the photograph was clicked at 12 o'clock in the afternoon. I do have shaded streets. I do have interactive surfaces. Can you please go to the next slide? That's the old city. Look at the windows opening onto the streets, very shaded, very secure. There is no way anyone can feel insecure while navigating the city or even feeling that they can get lost. These are exactly the principles that are necessary if we have to sustain or if we have to gravitate towards sustainable mobility. The only impediment is that the choices that we make. So I think the video that Fawzia started with was a perfect one, which says that it's a consumer behavior which becomes the first step towards the impediment. Then it goes on snowballing into a spiral. Now, I think then in the next segment, Adarsh will be explaining how cities and administrators already understand and have started walking towards how to change, how to transform and regain control. Adarsh, would you like to take over from this point?
Yeah, thank you, Shoni. So what I will do is I will try to keep the presentation simple and crisp. There are a few terms that I might be using. NMT, which is non-motorized transport, comprises of walking and cycling. So I might be using NMT often, which is why I thought I should explain that. And public transport is what I will use frequently. Now, if we look at the, Shomi, can you put yourself on mute?
Yeah.
If you look at the data that is available with us, our performance in the terms of environmental performance index is not very good. We generally need to do a lot to make sure that health issues and air quality issues, agriculture, forest, fisheries, and a lot of other issues are addressed properly. At the same time, if we look at the livability index, here also we realize that a lot is to be done. And if we look at these sectors of institutional, social, economic, and physical improvements, you will subsequently in the presentation, you will realize that mobility has a lot of role, significant amount of role to play in most of these. So whether it's governance, identity and culture, it's health, safety and security, economic opportunity, housing, open spaces, quality of open spaces, mixed use. Interestingly, mobility and especially sustainable mobility directly, indirectly impacts all of these. One very important aspect that we also need to understand is that our cities and our urban areas are not just for ourselves, it's for our children, it's for future generation. And whatever we do today also impacts what happens tomorrow. We also need to work very hard to make sure that air pollution and related issues with child health is reduced so that our future generations are healthier, which is where sustainable mobility plays a big role. The impacts of air quality, bad air quality is immense. And I'm not getting into the details, but if we don't work towards encouraging sustainable mobility, we have tough times ahead. We already are in a bad stage. So what I would suggest is if you are interested, you can write down these 5 questions. I've noticed that in most of my presentation, by the end of the presentation, everyone's answer to these 5 questions change. And if these are the answer to these 5 questions change, I feel that we've able to communicate. So is urban mobility in crisis? Yes or no? Is urban mobility crisis relevant to only public transport and NMT, which is walking and cycling users? Are most people who walk and cycle only from poor sections of society? Are most pedestrians and cyclists male members? Do your spouse, children, and parents need to walk? And if you see the presentation, you will realize that by the time you are towards the end of the presentation, your answers will change. I'll quickly go through some images of our cities, the problems that they've been facing. This is an image from Bhopal. And if you can see, there is a handicap in the middle of the street, and we all have people from various age group, physical condition accessing our streets and public spaces. Yet the condition of walking and cycling areas and public transport hubs are not in a good state. People are working towards it. We need to do more onto that. Bus stops, availability of bus stops, the area where you stand and wait for bus stops need improvement. The markets, public zones need improvement. We need areas where people can walk along shop frontages and buy their basic needs and other facilities. We also have ad hoc barriers onto the streets. In some cities, you have good footpath, but some insensitive placement of infrastructure facilities also impact its use. Then we have a huge problem with the increasing number of cars. Cars per se is not a problem for the city, but the impacts of uncontrolled growth in cars and encroachment of spaces because of cars is a problem. So whenever the cars start getting parked on the footpath and take away the space for pedestrians, then definitely there is a problem which needs to be addressed. The hilly towns and areas which have contoured have a different problem where they have to find out ways in which they have to negotiate with levels. In some cases, footpaths need to have stairs. So the hilly parts of our country have a different challenge altogether. At the same time, making the streets safe for women, children, and even senior citizens is very important. In some parts of our old cities, heritage cores, we also see problems associated with infrastructure and parking. And all of these start creating barriers for people to use streets as public spaces, people to walk and cycle, use public transport in these areas. So if I have to sum it up, and if any of you start identifying or imagining your daily lifestyle, you would realize that whether it's in the morning when you have to get out to go to school or to the office or to drop your family members to some places, you have to get into this kind of a situation where cars are coming from all direction. You have problems associated with encroachment, wrong parking, all of those. Then when you are in the middle of your day and you have to find means of having lunch or spending some time with your friends after the lunch. So those kind of times also you would realize that there is a lot of problem associated with finding the right place, looking for area where you can sit. And then back again towards the end of the day, you face similar problem in coming back to your home. So in essence, we all face similar problems. Somewhere the quantum is less or more, but we all go through this on a daily basis. And then after that, we get the kind of footpaths which are not accessible. So these are things which have already been understood. And now there are ways in which we need to address that. Now, one very important issue with streets and movement corridors is that we have realized that the number of cars are increasing significantly. So in a lot of cases, you would see traffic jams, you would see choked roads. Now, if we realize and if we understand congestion as a problem, it's not necessary that flyovers and expressway can solve the problem. This is one of the biggest engineering myths that have been sold to our cities. Flyovers and expressways can provide linkages across areas, but they don't solve the problem of congestion. If you have to address congestion, you probably have to encourage people to move towards public transport, walking and cycling. There are people who don't necessarily want to use cars. They are happy walking or using public transport. So encourage them to continue with that. Don't force them to use vehicles in accessing the city, which is another principle of making sure that we don't get into automobile dependency. We at least allow people to continue with walking, cycling, and use of public transport, which essentially means we have to redefine how we understand mobility, how we understand movement of people in our city. So if we are looking at this particular image, you would realize that the same number of people when they are in a car, in individual cars, they would take so much of space, whereas the same number of people are in a bus, they would take a very small amount of space. So this is an important thing that we all need to understand. Now, if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 essentially, and there were some few which were added later on. So 17 Sustainable Development Goals, out of which 6 or 7 are directly affected by the mobility choices. In fact, climate action also is the 7th one, which is directly affected by how we choose to move in and around the city, whether we use public transport or whether we walk or cycle. And remember one thing, even if you are using your private vehicle, at least to reach to the private vehicle or to get out of your private vehicle and reach your office or school, at that, in these two cases also, you have to walk. So walking is a basic need, basic activity that we all go through. We cannot avoid that. When we look at mobility, sustainable mobility planning, we essentially look at providing space for all road users, whether it's cars, public transport, walking, and cycling. And there is a balance that has to be achieved. Uh, a single mode of choice cannot start determining or enforcing taking away space from the other mode choices, which means if we start planning only for cars, we cannot just stop giving space for footpaths and cycle tracks and public transport. We can't do that. If we do that, we are then getting into this whole loop of automobile dependency. So we have to make sure that we encourage all kinds of movement patterns in the city. Now, essentially, we have pedestrian, cyclist, intermediate paratransit, which is autos, public transport, cars. These are the kind of modes that we have in our cities. And if we look at the kind of users, we have infants, caregivers, teenagers, women, senior citizens, differently able, all other kinds of users. We have to plan for all these users, and we have to give space for all these kinds of, and even some futuristic other modes which might come up in the next decades, will have to be provided space for. If we look at that, we are essentially talking about providing equal space or at least equitable space to all mode users. Make sure that the mobility choices are energy efficient, use lesser energy, and have lesser emission, and most importantly, if possible, no emission at all. Are environmentally friendly, are affordable, whether it's cycling or use of public transport, they have to be kept affordable. And these have to be safe. So whatever we do, we have to make sure that these all are met. So we're talking about walking and cycling improvement and public transport improvement. And one very important aspect that now the government is focusing on is how to make our cities accessible and friendly for children. Because if we don't allow children to move around in the cities, then they lose on the opportunity of being social beings and the amount of mental growth that is required to become a part of a community. So those are the kind of things that need to be also kept in mind, that we have to make sure that our cities are also accessible for children. At least the parts which are close to their houses, close to their schools, primary healthcare centers, not so much on the expressways, but closer to these areas which the children deserve to access. Another important part about Asian and especially Indian settlements is that we have a significant chunk of portion dependent on economic activities along the streets. So we have a lot of vendors. Culturally and socially, we are dependent on the vendors. It provides economic opportunities, and it also ensures that they participate in overall city building. This helps in a lot of issues. This helps in resolving a lot of concerns of the city, and it also encourages economic mobility. So we also need to make sure that our streets and public spaces look into providing these kind of spaces for hawkers and vendors. I'll quickly run through some of the case examples, because while we understand what are the problems, while we understand what all we need to focus upon, there is a lot of work happening in Indian cities. And it's time that we all acknowledge those work, because there was a time when we were all talking about how do we make sure that cities move towards that. thankfully now cities are working in these directions. So for example, if we look at Delhi, Delhi's master plan has been revised to incorporate the provisions of street design guidelines. Street design guidelines talk about principles for designing better streets, streets which are accessible, have footpaths, public transport, has provision for rainwater harvesting, a lot of cross-linking issues which affect our lifestyles, our environment, our behavior. So those principles first were ingrained in street design guidelines, and now they are also part of the Delhi Master. Along with that, we also have guidelines related to transit-oriented development, multimodal integration. I'll skip those, but essentially, these guidelines also talk about how do we make our cities sustainable through encouraging public transport, walking, and cycling uses. Then there are various public space improvement works that have happened in Delhi. Chhatarpur multimodal integration. Now DMRC is also improving the precincts of each station. In fact, in phase 3, if you go to some of the stations near Swaminagar, Panchsheel, Horse Khas, you would see that there is a small public space very close to the entry exit of the metro station. Bicycle sharing schemes are now becoming prominent across the country. There are pedestrianization projects which are being taken up. Various scales of pedestrianization projects are being taken up in the country. Ajmal Khan Road is one of the good examples that we have. And apart from that, now we also see that citizens are participating in these kind of dialogues. There was a point where citizens used to believe that this discussion on sustainable mobility is essentially a domain for engineers. But now they've realized that because it affects everyone's life, behavior, quality of environment, quality of health, it's important that they get involved. So now citizens are also interacting with government agencies, demanding what basic quality of public space and streets they need. Some cities have gone beyond just an area. Bhubaneswar, for example, has taken the benefits of smart city improvements to identify streets and areas for improvement, public spaces for improvement. They've also come up with their own set of street design guidelines on how to make streets more accessible and healthy. They've introduced public bicycle sharing schemes. They're working on smart streets, which make sure that the streets are safe and accessible. And then they're also working on transit-oriented development. Pune, again, has shown some good examples of bus rapid transit corridors where you have good quality bus infrastructure, better bus shelters, dedicated corridors for buses. And at the same time, you have wider footpaths, neater footpaths, spaces for recreation along footpath, and public bicycle sharing schemes, these areas. Kochi went a step ahead where Kochi started looking into integrating all various modes of transport into an umbrella, which is called Kochi Metro Rail Limited. So now city buses, water jetties, cycling tracks, walkways, autos, all of these are integrated into one system. So when you go from one place to another, and when you change the mode of transport, so for example, if you are taking an auto to reach to the metro station, and from the metro station, you reach to another station and there you change the mode, the information about these interchanges are provided together. The interchanges have been made very comfortable, so you can get down right at the metro station, very quickly go to the metro platform and move around freely. They've also looked into organizing these transport systems, making their streets and public spaces more accessible and healthy. In case of Nagpur, in a similar manner like Kochi, Nagpur is also looking into improvements of various modes and integrating them together. Chennai has a non-motorized transport policy through which they are encouraging wider and more accessible footpaths, cycle tracks, and they're trying to leverage the benefit out of this into making the spaces more healthy. Karnataka also, Bangalore also looked into a similar exercise where they improved the footpaths in their city, and then through the footpaths they were able to regenerate some of the old parts of their city. There are other examples also. This one is an example from Surat where what they did was they took the central water body in one of the roads, and along the water body, whatever green space they had, they redeveloped that into a nice public space where people could walk, cycle, and spend time with their family and friends. So these kind of examples, and I'm sure there are more examples across the country. I just took some examples out of the earlier presentations. And then we have other associated infrastructure which also plays an important role, whether it's playing areas, resting areas, utility areas, accessibility ramps. All of these then start adding on to streets. Leh, for example, what they did was they looked into streets without any level differences. So here, the only way of differentiating between footpath and vehicular zone was through bollards. Otherwise, it was all same level because Leh physical activities are slightly constrained, especially for tourists. So there, the city adopted a principle that they would have no level difference between footpaths and cycle tracks on a trial basis on one of the corridors. In a similar manner, Gangtok also started looking into pedestrianization of the market. Then you would also see ways in which cities are trying to raise awareness amongst its residents and road users through tactical intervention. Tactical interventions are quick and simple interventions along streets and public spaces through paints, movable stuffs. And the idea over here is to sensitize road users on traffic calming. So they have to slow down. They have to give space for pedestrians to cross. They have to stay within their own limited space, which is available. And they have to also make sure that these areas otherwise are accessible by all users. Same with the parks, and that is it.